Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Junior English, and we now turn to the genius American author James Baldwin. I'm with you on page 1081. You'll start with dates on 1081, 1924 to 1987. We're going to be looking at James Baldwin's text, The Rockpile, and a study of childhood tensions. Let's begin, first of all, though, with some background information on biography. Baldwin once told an interviewer that he never had a childhood. That will be significant for the story we're about to read. Because his stepfather worked long hours as both a preacher and a factory hand, Baldwin was given much of the responsibility for raising his 8 half-brothers and half-sisters. His main leisure activity was reading. He explained, quote, "As my half-brothers and half-sisters were born, I took them over with one hand and held a book with the other. In this way, in fact, I read just about everything I could get my hands on," end quote. Let's just pause for a moment and write this down. If you're going to be any kind of writer, you have to be some kind of reader. And often when you talk with authors, professional authors, one of the first things that professional authors will say is, if you are serious about writing, you must become a reader. It kind of makes sense. I don't know too many basketball players who don't watch basketball. I don't know too many baseball players that don't watch baseball. Do you know what I mean? In other words, you need the model, and that's what good reading does for us. All right? That's one thing good reading does for us. Baldwin's love of reading deepened his imagination, planting the seeds of inspiration for his later success as a writer. The next heading, A Harlem Childhood. Baldwin was born in Harlem, the New York community that served as a cultural center for African Americans during the 1920s and 30s. As a young boy, it was clear he had a gift for words, but Baldwin's deeply religious parents disapproved of his interest in literature. At age 14, Baldwin followed their wishes and became a preacher. However, encouraged by poet Conti Cullen, a poet we've already met, who taught in Baldwin's junior high school, and inspired by author Richard Wright, Baldwin decided to devote his life to writing, thankfully. Next heading, The Road to Writer. For several years, Baldwin worked at odd jobs while writing in his spare time. When he was 24, he won a fellowship that enabled him to live and write in Europe. For the next 4 years, he lived in Paris, where he completed his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, 1953, a really influential novel. By the way, let's just pause for a moment and point this out as well. Notice here, put this in your notes, the number of American writers who spent time elsewhere. I mean, we were just talking recently about Elizabeth Bishop spending a number of years in Brazil. It's significant that a lot of the writers who are so influential in the 20th century, American writers, spent a lot of time outside of America, and then were able to maybe critique American culture even more deeply. The book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, marked the beginning of a distinguished career that included novels, short stories, essays, plays. The final heading, A Powerful Witness. Baldwin once said, quote, "One writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give," end quote. Baldwin's work bears powerful witness to his own experience as an African American. He expresses the need for social justice as well as the universal desire for love. Because his books dig deeply into contemporary life, they are sometimes painful to read, but the pain is always tempered by hope and by Baldwin's magnificent language, and it is magnificent. I like this quote here on page 1081. "It is certain, in any case, that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." It's a beautiful quote, and it is a timely quote, obviously. Let's turn now to page 1080 and 2b, our rhetorical understandings and our literary analysis stuff as we set us up for this story. The setting, I would write that down. We're going to concentrate on setting now in our analysis of this story. The setting of a story is the time and place in which it occurs. It may include details about the weather, physical features of the landscape, and other elements of an environment. The Rockpile is set in Harlem during the 1930s, so let's write that down at level 1. This story is set in the 1930s in Harlem. Life in that time and place was influenced by the difficult economic and social realities that people faced. A story's setting can also serve as a symbol. Let's write this word down, S-Y-M-B-O-L. You're writing that one down at level 2A. A symbol is a person, place, object that has a meaning in itself but also suggests a larger meaning. While it's not the story's only symbol, the rock pile that dominates the setting is its most important one. So let's write that down at 2B, so you already kind of know something about the story as you pick up the reading. Among other meanings, the rock pile can be interpreted as a symbol for violence and failure in the community. For example, they fought on the rock pile, sure-footed, dangerous, and reckless. They rushed each other and grappled on the heights. As you read, note how the narrator describes the rock pile, the characters that are associated with it, the events that take place there. These details will help you interpret the symbolic meanings of the rock pile. Under reading strategy, take a look at that. We're going to be looking at cause and effect. We want to identify cause and effect relationships in a story to better understand it. In this story, for example, a child's disobedience results in a series of events that reveal a complicated family dynamic. And as you read, use the chart to the right to help you. Also, finally, for exam prep, make sure that you do know these 5 vocabulary words. They will be on the exam, and they also are going to come up, obviously, in the story. All right, let's go to 1083, the rock pile's background information really quickly. Even though, I hope you're reading with me on 1083, even though he spent most of his adult life in Europe, James Baldwin's impassioned voice is full of the rhythms and details of life in Harlem, the New York City neighborhood where he grew up. This story about a struggling Harlem family is a strong example of Baldwin's connection to the place that shaped him as both writer and a person. So let's pay attention in our story to 2 things. Write this down again at level 1. We want to pay attention to setting, and more particularly to this description of Harlem in the 1930s. And 2, we want to pay attention to this rock pile as a symbol, everything that goes on. Now in this story, you're going to have interesting analyses of family relationships. So let's write that down at level 1 as well, so you're looking for that. Family relationships in this story are complicated. There's lots of family conflicts in this story. Okay? And we're going to have in this story a response to a child's disobedience. So let's pay attention to that as well. Now we have professional reader reading for us. Again, the challenge is to pay attention. Actually read the words as you are hearing the words. This will help you as well stay engaged so that you can really pay attention. All right, here we go. Let's pay attention now. Baldwin's The Rock Pile.
The Rock Pile by James Baldwin. Across the street from their house, in an empty lot between 2 houses, stood the rock pile. It was a strange place to find a mass of natural rock jutting out of the ground, and someone, probably Aunt Florence, had once told him that the rock was there and could not be taken away because without it, the subway cars underground would fly apart, killing all the people. This, touching on some natural mystery concerning the surface and the center of the earth, was far too intriguing an explanation to be challenged, and it invested the rock pile, moreover, with such mysterious importance that Roy felt it to be his right, not to say his duty, to play there. Other boys were to be seen there each afternoon after school and all day Saturday and Sunday. They fought on the rock pile. Sure-footed, dangerous, and reckless, they rushed each other and grappled on the heights, sometimes disappearing down the other side in a confusion of dust and screams and upended flying feet. "It's a wonder they don't kill themselves," their mother said, watching sometimes from the fire escape. "You children stay away from there, you hear me?" Though she said children, she was looking at Roy, where he sat beside John on the fire escape. "The good Lord knows," she continued, "I don't want you to come home bleeding like a hog every day the Lord sends." Roy shifted impatiently and continued to stare at the street, as though in this gazing he might somehow acquire wings. John said nothing. He had not really been spoken to. He was afraid of the rock pile and of the boys who played there. Each Saturday morning, John and Roy sat on the fire escape and watched the forbidden street below. Sometimes their mother sat in the room behind them, sewing or dressing their younger sister or nursing the baby, Paul. The sun fell across them and across the fire escape with a high, benevolent indifference. Below them, men and women and boys and girls, sinners all, loitered. Sometimes one of the church members passed and saw them and waved. Then, for the moment that they waved decorously back, they were intimidated. They watched the saint, man or woman, until he or she had disappeared from sight. The passage of one of the redeemed made them consider, however vacantly, the wickedness of the street, their own latent wickedness in sitting where they sat. and made them think of their father, who came home early on Saturdays and who would soon be turning this corner and entering the dark hall below them. But until he came to end their freedom, they sat, watching and longing above the street. At the end of the street nearest their house was the bridge which spanned the Harlem River and led to a city called the Bronx, which was where Aunt Florence lived. Nevertheless, when they saw her coming, she did not come from the bridge, but from the opposite end of the street. This, weakly to their minds, she explained by saying that she had taken the subway, not wishing to walk, and that, besides, she did not live in that section of the Bronx. Knowing that the Bronx was across the river, they did not believe this story ever, but, adopting toward her their father's attitude, assumed that she had just left some sinful place which she dared not name, as, for example, a movie palace. In the summertime, boys swam in the river, diving off the wooden dock, or wading in from the garbage-heavy bank. Once a boy, whose name was Richard, drowned in the river. His mother had not known where he was. She had even come to their house to ask if he was there. Then in the evening, at 6 o'clock, they had heard from the street a woman screaming and wailing, and they ran to the windows and looked out. Down the street came the woman, Richard's mother, screaming, her face raised to the sky and tears running down her face. A woman walked beside her, trying to make her quiet and trying to hold her up. Behind them walked a man, Richard's father, with Richard's body in his arms. There were 2 white policemen walking in the gutter who did not seem to know what should be done. Richard's father and Richard were wet, and Richard's body lay across his father's arms like a cotton baby. The woman's screaming filled all the street. Cars slowed down, and the people in the cars stared. People opened their windows and looked out and came rushing out of doors to stand in the gutter, watching. Then the small procession disappeared within the house which stood beside the rock pile. Then, Lord, 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 cried Elizabeth, their mother, and slammed the window down. One Saturday, an hour before his father would be coming home, Roy was wounded on the rock pile and brought screaming upstairs. He and John had been sitting on the fire escape, and their mother had gone into the kitchen to sip tea with Sister McCandless. By and by, Roy became bored and sat beside John in restless silence. And John began drawing into his school book a newspaper advertisement which featured a new electric locomotive. Some friends of Roy passed beneath the fire escape and called him. Roy began to fidget, yelling down to them through the bars. Then a silence fell. John looked up. Roy stood looking at him. "I'm going downstairs," he said. "You better stay where you is, boy. You know Mama don't want you going downstairs. I'll be right back. She won't even know I'm gone unless you run and tell her." "I ain't got to tell her. What's going to stop her from coming in here and looking out the window?" "She's talking," Roy said. He started into the house. "But Daddy's going to be home soon. I'll be back before that. What you all the time got to be so scared for?" He was already in the house, and he now turned, leaning on the windowsill, to swear impatiently, "I'll be back in 5 minutes." John watched him sourly as he carefully unlocked the door and disappeared. In a moment, he saw him on the sidewalk with his friends. He did not dare to go and tell his mother that Roy had left the fire escape because he had practically promised not to. He started to shout, "Remember, you said 5 minutes!" But one of Roy's friends was looking up at the fire escape. John looked down at his school book. He became engrossed again in the problem of the locomotive. When he looked up again, he did not know how much time had passed. But now there was a gang fight on the rock pile. Dozens of boys fought each other in the harsh sun, clambering up the rocks and battling hand to hand, scuffed shoes sliding on the slippery rock, filling the bright air with curses and jubilant cries. They filled the air, too, with flying weapons. Stones, sticks, tin cans, garbage, whatever could be picked up and thrown. John watched in a kind of absent amazement until he remembered that Roy was still downstairs and that he was one of the boys on the rock pile. Then he was afraid. He could not see his brother among the figures in the sun, and he stood up, leaning over the fire escape railing. Then Roy appeared from the other side of the rocks. John saw that his shirt was torn. He was laughing. He moved until he stood at the very top of the rock pile. Then something, an empty tin can, flew out of the air and hit him on the forehead just above the eye. Immediately, one side of Roy's face ran with blood. He fell and rolled on his face down the rocks. Then for a moment, there was no movement at all, no sound. The son, arrested, lay on the street and the sidewalk and the arrested boys. Then someone screamed or shouted. Boys began to run away, down the street, toward the bridge. The figure on the ground, having caught its breath and felt its own blood, began to shout. John cried, "Mama! Mama!" and ran inside. "Don't fret," panted Sister McCandless as they rushed down the dark, narrow, swaying stairs. "Don't fret. Ain't a boy been born don't get his knocks every now and again. Lord." They hurried into the sun. A man had picked Roy up and now walked slowly toward them. One or two boys sat silent on their stoops. At either end of the street there was a group of boys watching. "He ain't hurt bad," the man said. "Wouldn't be making this kind of noise if he was hurt real bad." Elizabeth, trembling, reached out to take Roy, but Sister McCandless, bigger, calmer, took him from the man and threw him over her shoulder as she once might have handled a sack of cotton. "God bless you," she said to the man. "God bless you, son." Roy was still screaming. Elizabeth stood behind Sister McCandless to stare at his bloody face. "It's just a flesh wound," the man kept saying. "Just broke the skin, that's all." They were moving across the sidewalk toward the house. John, now afraid of the staring boys, looked toward the corner to see if his father was yet in sight. Upstairs, they hushed Roy's crying. They bathed the blood away to find, just above the left eyebrow, the jagged, superficial scar. "Lord have mercy," murmured Elizabeth. "Another inch and it would have been his eye." And she looked with apprehension toward the clock. "Ain't it the truth?" said Sister McCandless, busy with bandages and iodine. "When did he go downstairs?" his mother asked at last.
The question, right?
Sister McCandless now sat fanning herself in the easy chair at the head of the sofa where Roy lay, bound and silent. She paused for a moment to look sharply at John. John stood near the window, holding a newspaper advertisement and a drawing he had done.
Right? So let's go ahead and pause for a moment at level one. We've got a story, correct, where we've got this dynamic in play where you've got a child who has disobeyed and, of course, a brother who's now going to get caught in the middle. You could easily jump to 3B and ask, when was the last time this happened to you in your life? When you were completely innocent other than the fact you didn't narc or tell, but now you're in the middle of the question, how did this happen, right? Now, let's pay attention to what we call cause and effect. So you have this action committed by Roy, and now you're going to have a bit of different kinds of effects, right? You can already start to predict some of the problems that are about to ensue. Let's pay attention.
"We were sitting on the fire escape," he said. "Some boys he knew called him." "When?" "He said he'd be back in 5 minutes." "Why didn't you tell me he was downstairs?" He looked at his hands, clasping his notebook, and did not answer. "Boy," said Sister McCandless, "you hear your mother talking to you?" He looked at his mother. He repeated, "He said he'd be back in 5 minutes." "He said he'd be back in 5 minutes," said Sister McCandless with scorn. "Don't look to me like that's no right answer. You's the man of the house. You're supposed to look after your baby brothers and sisters. You ain't supposed to let them run off and get half killed. But I expect," she added, rising from the chair and dropping the cardboard fan, "your daddy'll make you tell the truth. Your ma's way too soft with you." He did not look at her, but at the fan where it lay in the dark red, depressed seat where she had been. The fan advertised a pomade for the hair and showed a brown woman and her baby, both with glistening hair, smiling happily at each other. "Honey," said Sister McCandless, "I got to be moving along. Maybe I'll drop in later tonight. I don't reckon you're going to be at Terry service tonight." Terry service was the prayer meeting held every Saturday night at church to strengthen believers and prepare the church for the coming of the Holy Ghost on Sunday. "I don't reckon," said Elizabeth. She stood up. She and Sister McCandless kissed each other on the cheek. "But you be sure to remember me in your prayers." "I surely will do that." She paused with her hand on the doorknob and looked down at Roy and laughed. "Poor little man," she said. "Reckon he'll be content to sit on the fire escape now." Elizabeth laughed with her. "It sure ought to be a lesson to him." "You don't reckon," she asked nervously, still smiling, "you're going to keep that scar, do you?" "Lord, no," said Sister McCandless. Ain't nothing but a scratch. I declare, Sister Grimes, you worse than a child. Another couple of weeks and you won't be able to see no scar. Now you go on about your housework, honey, and thank the Lord it wasn't no worse. She opened the door. They heard the sound of feet on the stairs. I expect that's the Reverend, said Sister McCandless placidly. I bet he going to raise Cain. Maybe it's Florence, Elizabeth said. Sometimes she get here about this time. They stood in the doorway staring while the steps reached the landing below and began again climbing to their floor. No, said Elizabeth then. That ain't her walk. That's Gabriel. Well, I'll just go on, said Sister McCandless, and kind of prepare his mind. She pressed Elizabeth's hand as she spoke and started into the hall, leaving the door behind her slightly ajar. Elizabeth turned slowly back into the room. Roy did not open his eyes or move, but she knew that he was not sleeping. He wished to delay until the last possible moment any contact with his father. John put his newspaper and his notebook on the table and stood, leaning on the table, staring at her. It wasn't my fault, he said. I couldn't stop him from going downstairs. No, she said. You ain't got nothing to worry about. You just tell your daddy the truth. He looked directly at her, and she turned to the window, staring into the street. What was Sister McCandless saying? Then from her bedroom, she heard Delilah's thin wail, and she turned, frowning, looking toward the bedroom and toward the still open door. She knew that John was watching her. Delilah continued to wail. She thought angrily, now that girl's getting too big for that. But she feared that Delilah would awaken Paul, and she hurried into the bedroom. She tried to soothe Delilah back to sleep. Then she heard the front door open and close. Too loud. Delilah raised her voice. With an exasperated sigh, Elizabeth